Nvidia is like amazing. What they've built so far is like really valuable, but looking 5 years down the lane or something, we can't have the entire LLM infra just running on one single chipset. Most people don't want to put all their eggs in one basket, rely heavily just on Nvidia GPUs. And second is like getting availability of these chips are like incredibly like hard. Like if you want like quota for 100 Nvidia H100s, good luck trying to find that in any of these big clouds. I think one big trade-off most people make today is between large models and small models. Many go with like 8 billion instead of 70B or a 400B Llama 3s because 8 billion model is much more easy to fit on like a GPU, and you don't need to orchestrate this multi-GPU training and all that, which is like much more complex engineering. I
Right.
think there are some use cases wherein getting a 405B would dramatically increase the reasoning capabilities of your model. I really doubt if they'll ever make a good open source or portable because that's their biggest differentiator.
I've heard how twins seem to have like certain telepathic abilities. Is that a thing? Like, are you able to read each other's thoughts?
No, I don't think so. Like based on amount of like disagreements.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Svagat Show where we feature incredible Indians in Europe doing awesome things. I'm so excited to have my guest today, Nikhil. Nikhil and I met like maybe earlier this year where I was just cold reaching out to anybody who was doing anything interesting in Europe. And Nikhil was working at Meta at that time. And I was asking him, hey, what are you up to? And that's how we got talking. And fast forward, he's now gotten into YC, which he applied for while he was still working at Meta. And so excited to see him on his entrepreneurial journey with his twin brother. So, Nikhil, congrats on getting into YC and welcome on the show. What do you think would surprise European operators about YC?
Yeah, firstly, like thank you so much. Like meeting you like back then and you were building this community, which was amazing. I came attended few meetups. Yeah, I think regarding what would surprise about YC, I think at least for me, like the most rewarding has been meeting these famous successful founders and hearing from them their journey. Second, somehow this 3 months period is works quite well. I think it's like this condensed period wherein you need to build something, iterate, quickly validate and sell and repeat this whole cycle. That has been like quite valuable for me.
Yeah. And the other part I've noticed is you seem to be going all in on family because I remember when we first met, you were moonlighting on some side projects where you were working with your wife, who's also an engineer, and now you're
Yeah.
starting this company with your brother. What do you think are the pros and cons of doing projects with family?
Yeah, but that's a great question, I think. I think pros are like it's super easy to get started. Like you know them already for years. You have this connection for a long time. And second, I think it's also there's some level of trust which is already baked in because you've spent so much time with them. And lastly, I think the communication overhead is quite small. I don't know if there's any con, but like maybe one is because we have this free flowing conversation, it's maybe much easier to have disagreements. Unlike in a professional setting, if it's a colleague, you have, okay, you think a bit more before saying things. Whereas with like family and close friends, you're much more open and you share everything. So maybe there's slightly more disagreements, but I don't think it's a real.
Is there, I've heard how twins seem to have like certain telepathic abilities. Is that a thing? Like, are you able to read each other's thoughts?
No, I don't think so. Like based on amount of like disagreements, yeah, we don't read each other, I think. Yeah.
Interesting. Cool, man. So, your startup, Felafax, it's a platform to train AI models on essentially non-Nvidia chipsets. Can you just sort of give the audience some sort of a primer on just how big the non-Nvidia chipset ecosystem is? Like, because normally one just hears a lot about the Nvidia GPUs. So, like, how big is it? Where all is it really used? And how do you sort of see it growing?
Yeah, sure. Like, so there are already bunch of accelerators which are non-NVIDIA. Like Google has this famous one called Google TPUs, and AWS is now starting with their own chip called AWS Trainium. And then there are like other players like AMD has their own GPUs, Intel have their own GPUs. So these all can be broadly classified as non-NVIDIA. And where do we fit in as like today, like, yeah, as you said, like most common use case for any of these Gen AI LLM applications is NVIDIA because NVIDIA has over a decade of close integration with Pytorch using its CUDA kernels. So the performance per dollar is like really good there. And if you just use any other chip like TPU or Trainium and try to run the same PyTorch code, it's not that efficient. And also, like, there's so much challenges to just get it up and running because there's no CUDA API. And yeah, like where we fit in is we are trying to make it easier to run any of these popular LLM use cases like fine tuning and training or inference on these non-NVIDIA chipsets, like building the entire stack. And yeah, that's
Why
kind
why
of our.
would why would somebody use non-Nvidia chipsets? Is it primarily because they can't get Nvidia chipsets, or is it like I'm just trying to understand
Yeah.
the case where a demand would arise for something like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, there is no doubt, like, Nvidia is like amazing. What they've built so far is like really valuable. But looking 5 years down the lane or something, we can't have the entire LLM infra just running on one single chipset. And also, like, we have been talking with all these other players in AMD and Google TPUs. There are like amazing chips out there. Most people don't want to put all their eggs in one basket, rely heavily just on Nvidia GPUs. Second is like getting availability of these chips are like incredibly like hard. Like if you want like quota for 100 NVIDIA H100s, good luck trying to find that in any of these big clouds. And now the alternative is like, can you use like these other chipsets which are actually 50% cheaper to do what you want and you have like much more capacity available? Like, so there's a lot of demand around this. There is very little infra around fine tuning this. So that's one big value proposition from our side is we want to differentiate and hey, you can easily go use this 50% cheaper resource to like fine tune a large model and derive much better value for your customers than like just relying on these smaller models. I think one big trade-off most people make today is between large models and small models. Many go with like 8 billion instead of 70B or a 400B Llama 3s because 8 billion model is much more easy to fit on like a GPU and you don't need to orchestrate this multi GPU training and all that, which is like much more complex engineering. So I think
Yeah.
that's one trade-off.
Hasn't that already sort of been solved where people are like, you know what, as you don't need the biggest model as long as you just invest more in fine tuning, you'll be okay. Like, do you really need, like, isn't there like some sort of a diminishing returns for most companies there?
I mean, that seems to be the thesis right now, but like people are interested in these large models and trying to figure out where they can fit in because it's one of those models which are very close to GPT-4, like Llama 4B, and they're looking at creative ways to include it in their own use cases, like especially healthcare companies. I
Right.
think there are some use cases wherein getting a 405B would dramatically increase the reasoning capabilities of your model. And second, I think the other use cases is using 4B to train a smaller model, the student teacher sort of architecture. I think that's one use case which is now developing, I think.
What, so like walk me through what got you to arrive at this idea, right? Because I remember
Yeah.
when we last spoke, you guys were, and this was like you and your wife, where you were just sort of like not commercially but just like tinkering, trying to figure out something on the DevOps side. I
Yeah.
remember. And your brother obviously has worked in Google, and you've obviously worked at Meta. So there's a certain scale that you sort of observe in companies of these sizes. So I'm just sort of wondering, like, what are sort of the observations that led you to arrive at an idea like this, and like what is it that you've typically noticed in some of these companies that led you to arrive at this?
Yeah, I think like a huge credit to this idea is just my brother. He spent like working in all these large tech companies building these the exact same thing of distributed training infra within these teams. And over time, like he thought like, okay, there should be like easier ways to do it on other hardware too. And we had this kind of in an moment wherein we thought, hey, why is it not like people are not using other chipsets and is there something here we should explore? And that's how the idea got started. Yeah, like as you said, like I was working on DevOps space. And when I heard this idea, I started looking in a bit. And one thing that was like amazing here is like that's incredible scale opportunity and also like building this low level infra, which I really enjoy doing. So yeah, I jumped on board.
Got it. Any kinds of conversations that you had that gave you a little bit more sort of confidence in going down this path, or was it primarily just having worked in companies where you could sort of see the market? Like how do you go about developing conviction for something like this, or even arriving at a specific idea around which part of it you're going to target?
Yeah, I think over the months, like we have ended up refining more and more. Like our initial thing was, hey, we'll build a distributed training infra, and that was very generic. But like talking to various customers, like two biggest use cases that are existing today is like fine tuning and inference. And so we kind of narrowed it down. And looking more, also realized this cost benefit and few other things, which made it like more like, hey, there is something here that we should explore more. And yeah, I would say we are still in like super early stages of exploring this path. Like we are just starting out, like building on top of these non-Nvidia chipsets and trying to like see its full potential. But yeah, there is something here that we thought is interesting to explore.
Got it. And so what would good early design partners look like for you guys?
Yeah, I think people who are already in these have deployments in these clouds like GCP or AWS and looking for their own VPC deployment of LLM infra on open source models like Llama 3 or Gemma. They want to fine tune and deploy their fine tuned models. I think these are the people who we are initially targeting because for them, since they're fine tuning and deploying, they need an infra which runs on their cloud. And also, like the cost part makes a difference. If you're fine tuning frequently, if it's 50% cheaper using the same provider like TPU on Google Cloud instead of Nvidia, there is a big value add there. So those are the people who we are initially like trying to target.
Got it. What about, I mean, a lot of what you're doing obviously in some ways hinges on how Nvidia thinks about the portability of their software, right? So like when you look at something like a CUDA, what are the current challenges? And like is Nvidia looking to make their software more portable?
Yeah, I mean, from a technical standpoint, like CUDA is like amazing thing. Like there's no challenge, like any drawbacks in CUDA. Like, but regarding them making it portable, I doubt if they'll ever do that because like that's their single biggest differentiator against any other GPU provider. And this PyTorch is so well integrated with CUDA that like the performance there is, I mean, amazing. Like there are alternatives to CUDA called XLA, which is a
Which is open
compiler
source
technique.
and
Yeah, like all these non-NVIDIA kind of support XLA and you can build infra on top of it. Like you can do PyTorch XLA to run on these non-NVIDIA, but the performance is still not there. Like PyTorch XLA is in nascent days and this CUDA has like amazing integration. So I really doubt if they'll ever make it open source or portable because that's their biggest differentiator. But yeah, it's an incredible piece of software.
unless they see external competition coming in from other players, and then as a response to that they might be forced to do something.
Yeah,
I mean, who
that
would
like
have
yeah,
thought Microsoft would be open source? Like growing up in
yeah,
the
yeah,
90s, like it was like unheard of, right?
yeah.
No, that's interesting. And so on the other side, like how much of like PyTorch and TensorFlow's focus is on building for the NVIDIA ecosystem? Obviously, TensorFlow being Google, obviously would want somewhere in their vested interest, they are also thinking about promoting the TPU ecosystem. But like, I'm just sort of thinking, like, given PyTorch and TensorFlow, they're already sort of support TPUs. Like, what's the unique value that you're hoping that your layer will add beyond what's already available?
Yeah, like regarding PyTorch supporting TPU, it's on paper, it's like, yeah, okay, PyTorch XLA runs on TPU, but just getting it up and running on TPU is like so many challenges with like the right dependencies and the right like modules and things. Even after like once you get it up and running, like the performance today is like not at par with just running PyTorch on NVIDIA. So like for most people, like it's just easier to just take their model, run it on NVIDIA. There's so much more resources out there. So our differentiator is going to be like we want to firstly like make the PyTorch XLA work well. And second, we are building on top of this other framework called JAX, which is much more closely integrated with TPU and the entire XLA thing, and which should give us like differentiator in terms of like performance there. And
Hmm.
yeah, I think your second question was around support for already on this thing, TPU or PyTorch
Yeah, yeah,
XLA.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah, it's still like quite nascent for PyTorch XLA. Like it doesn't just work out of box, and there are very few resources out there to make
Mm-hmm.
it run.
Interesting. And when you look at companies like the hyperscalers, right? Like the large companies. So imagine, the usual Mag 7 and, Adobe's of the world, and like some of these large
Yeah.
companies. How much of this do they actually have sort of built in house? Like, I'm just trying to understand, like, is there, because my sense is eventually you would want some of the larger players to be using your products as well. And so as you sort of talk to some of these people, how much of this do they actually have built in house? Because they would have been doing some work already on this, right? And like,
Yeah.
is that a big enough challenge for them?
Yeah. I mean, like these large top seven, I mean, folks, I think these people have huge engineering teams building out this entire infra for like doing pre-training and training and inference and things.
Yeah.
And I think they're already like they have these very custom stacks for their specific things, like Llama 3 for Meta, and like for Google, it's Gemini. For so I think those people might not have like a need for our open source solution at this point, but I think anyone other than that, they would need to like build out the similar infra if they want to scale up their operations and just repeat putting so much engineering effort. And doing this is where I think we can help differentiate, wherein we can
Hmm.
make it easier for them to do the ML ops part. So they just have to worry about building things on top of it and focus on their business critical needs rather than worrying again about the infra which we want to like kind of go solve.
And so, like, I'm just also wondering, which then sort of brings us to how do you, like, is this something that you feel you might have to create a need for? Is this something that you're already seeing a pull from the market? And related to that is, like, what's the pitch to convince, an ML engineer working at, say, a Series D company, right? They're engineers and data scientists who are already like very familiar with CUDA, and you'll be like, hey, I wanted to switch to the platform or something like that. Like, do you foresee it to be that way, or is it going to be more like, hey, there's already enough people saying we're using these other tools, but like we're just pissed off with the existing sort of infra which exists, and you just have to be like, hey, everybody's asking for it anyways, I just need to throw my product out there, and it's just going to grow from there. Like, have you guys thought about that?
Yeah, like we have thought a bit. Our thing is we just don't want to sell on being non-Nvidia sort of thing. Like what we are selling is like, hey, we built the entire ML ops stack so that you can quickly come like select I want 256 TPU cores and I want to fine tune Llama 3, and it just spins up all these things and you just get a Python notebook within few minutes. You can go fine tune that, and that's kind of our one of our products today, which is like this cloud UI layer on top of our infra. And on top of that, our differentiation would be like, hey, if you use this, you will be 2x more cost efficient. So like if someone is having a regular fine tuning continuous pre-training use case or something, it's like much more cheaper. And the second differentiation we are thinking of is like you can deploy this in-house in your own VPC of AWS or GCP cloud, take the benefits of like the lower cost and also like the performance. Like we think like we can match like the performance of NVIDIA. And secondly, like the last thing is like access to GPUs. Even all the big players, big cloud providers, it's still hard to get like as many GPUs as you want, but these other chips are much more easily accessible.
Got it. Got it. Is somewhere, just sort of, because I know that, you guys obviously believe a lot in OSS, and that's sort of the approach that you're thinking of as well. Where does that fit into just your go to market? Obviously, when I was the CMO at AppSmith, we saw like a lot of adoption because of OSS. And one of the things that it did for us was, how you have this technology adoption lifecycle curve where you say, hey,
Yeah.
start with small companies, then move to mid-sized companies, and go to enterprise companies. And OSS sort of just turns that model on its feet, because on day one you might have like NASA using you, or like really
Oh,
large
nice. Yeah.
companies using, but in the same time you obviously have a lot of requirements from users. So just wanted to get your views on just OSS as a distribution channel, as obviously a product development channel, because you find out what your users are thinking of, and at the same time I think what I found interesting was that you're not trying to do something from scratch, but you're building on top of already an existing open source project. So like there's already sort of like an inbuilt community which exists, which might sort of
Yeah.
migrate or get attracted towards what you're doing with that. So like, just Yeah, I know I rambled for a lot of different topics, but would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, like no, but I mean, what you mentioned is like one of the benefits. I think open source is like it's much easier developer adoption. Like people come try it out and they see the value and then decide like whether this is something I should invest my time in. And our main thesis for open source was like we wanted to make it easier for anyone to just run. Like we spent 2, 3 weeks just trying to get some PyTorch models running on XLA hardware and we open source the notebooks for running both Llama 3 and Gemma on these non-XLA things. So our goal was like it should be super easy for anyone who wants to try out non-Nvidia hardware to come and use it, spin up their own TPUs and things and like run it. But if they're looking for even simpler solution where we orchestrate the entire solution, they can use a cloud sort of solution, which can takes care of abstracts away even more challenges. And you just come use it for like spinning up the TPU and run the entire notebook. Yeah, that
Hmm.
was sort of our hypothesis. But yeah, this is an interesting field that we want to explore more. I don't think we have thought much into the open source, why we shouldn't be open source or why should we be more open source. But yeah, like we just thought would be valuable for developers to like get access to like these notebooks.
Yeah, and obviously the world is sort of divided on open source and AI at the model level, right? Where
Yeah,
obviously Meta is sort of been championing open source quite a bit
yeah,
versus the company which was supposed to be open source is not open source, and
yeah,
it's just incredible where just how quickly it's been advancing. And the beauty there is that you don't need everyone to be open source, but as long as one of the dominant players are open source, like it sort of in some ways ends up pushing everyone else
yeah.
to either become open source or then compensate in other ways through product differentiation or whatever.
Yeah, I totally agree. And also, there's so much resources for open source and developer support. I think being open source and engaging with developers might be easier to also like build out the vision and like get their feedback early on, hey, is this something they care about? What is the biggest problem they're having and build that out.
Yeah. In many ways, I find it's very interesting to see how, if you think of, I think there was a discussion happening in another forum where we were discussing how cloud companies really like open source because their revenue model is essentially just slap a cloud layer on
Yeah,
hosting and, orchestration and infra and all of that stuff. So you could see like a lot of cloud companies really embrace open source because they're like, hey, open source will bring visibility, distribution, all of that stuff, and the community. And then we have a very ready sort of revenue model by just creating a cloud version of something, right? We've seen this with Databricks, we've seen this with MongoDB, we've seen this with bunch of SQL providers and all of that stuff, right? So it's very sort
yeah,
of interesting to see where you guys fit into that, because if what you're sort of primarily providing is something that can be hosted on the cloud, then like in many ways you don't really need to worry about this whole dichotomy of whether OSS or not, because that's not necessarily where the core value is. Somebody that wants to do it on their own, great, let them do it, but like most likely they'll come to you for some of the other things as well, and so people have a choice.
yeah. Like that was our thinking too. Like we want to make it easier to get started. Like if you want to just take a Llama 3 and run it on a non-XLA, I mean non-Nvidia GPU and see it for yourself. Like hey, use these resources. But if you're looking for, I mean, most enterprises, they don't want to go set up their own ML infra to orchestrate all this. And they might just look for an hosted version of this or where we can come in and help them deploy that and create a
Hmm.
unique value proposition there.
Got it. Got it. Just coming back to the use cases that you guys are talking about, do you already see a lot of startups sort of toying with TPUs and AMD's products and all these other things already, or do you foresee that there being some sort of evangelism that you might have to do for especially the early stage? Like for example, when you look at your YC cohort, for example, right?
Yeah,
uh, I'm assuming, and tell me if I'm wrong, that 70% of the companies in the current YC batch would be in some ways working on some form of AI where they're doing fine tuning, inference, all of that stuff, right? Do
yeah.
you in your batch see people who are considering non NVIDIA chips?
There are like very few, but I think, yeah, we are in super early stages because to get started on this NVIDIA chips, it's so much easier and there's so many resources out there. Like suppose you want to do your own inference on an Nvidia chip, there are like amazing OSS repositories like VLLM or Lorax, which you can just download and set up. Like, hey, I want my Llama 3 running on GCP. Similar thing doesn't exist for non-Nvidia. The developer ecosystem is much more primitive. So yeah, I do think we are still in the early stages of this, wherein it's not so easy to just switch from NVIDIA to non-NVIDIA, but like that is where I think we want to like come but help build some of those tools and make it easier and easier. Many of these companies get like 500,000 in free credits. And at that point, you're mostly not thinking so much of resources like NVIDIA versus others. But eventually those credits will run out and you'll start paying from your real dollars. Like at that point, if it's like 50% cheaper, it's so much better. And also like if you can unlock these other GPUs either in AWS or like GCP and like take advantage of that, that's also going to be like super valuable. And even with credits, like if you can use your credits more effectively, like why not like make it last twice as long? That's also one way where we can help.
Yeah. Is is 500,000 a lot when it comes to these credits? Like, what has your sense been? Because, like, for example, I know that obviously the regular cloud credits that people give of all the big three hyperscalers, right? Like, I've seen where if you're a startup, unless you're doing something really crazy, it can go up to as long as like a year and a half. Like, like a 300K credit can last quite a bit. How is it on the AI side? Like, do they just get over really fast? Like, what have you seen? Because I think YC gives credits as well, right? Don't they? Like, what
Yeah,
have you noticed? Like,
YC also like partners with like AWS and GCP, and these big cloud providers have their own credits for like startups. And yeah, you are true. Like the regular VM instances, like some 250K or 300K credits last a long time, but GPUs are like super expensive and also like to do fine tuning and things you need to try multiple experimentation and then run inference and these are really expensive use cases, so they don't last as long as you initially like plan for. It's always good to like have diverse options in back of your mind and also like see if there is a much cheaper way to do it.
hmm, got it. Let's switch gears and talk about what is it like to think of an idea while you're still working. And obviously, I don't know how hard you were working in terms of like how hectic was the job, but both of you obviously were working in large companies on massive projects. And I'm just thinking around how was that experience where it's almost like you have two ideas in your head, right? Because you guys directly started after quitting your jobs, and so just like I'm also thinking of it from the advice that you would give, because there's a lot of people who are working in companies who might have an idea, who might be thinking of starting up, and typically there are two approaches to this, right? Approach one is, let me just quit my job and then I'll figure out what I want to do. Your approach was a different approach, and so if you could just walk us through what were you guys thinking, how did it come to be, and just in terms of any advice for people who might be in the same shoes as you were not very long back.
Both my like wife and my brother, we were like passionate about building like startups from very early on. That's why like I partnered with my wife like about 2 years back to look at this startup thing. And my brother, like we have been building things on site for like over 10 years, right from college days. Regarding like, yeah, the two options of dilemma of like whether should I quit full time and do it or like whether should I explore this. I would always recommend like there's no perfect timing. Like for me, like I was interested in building something, like even my wife was, so we just started like during our free time, like think of like what are the biggest problems that users have and like who do we talk to and go to meetups and all these are quite easy thing to do. Like when you're already working, you have like some free time in the evening where you can go interact with like amazing people around you and like learn. I would say like start off there. And if you find like, I think one thing with tech is the building is the easiest part. I think anyone can go build something in 2 3 weeks. The hardest part is selling it to users and finding a problem which people really want solved. So like go figure out all these things, and once you nail an idea which you think is really valuable, like go pursue on it full time. Like I think that would be the best path. And lastly, yeah, like trying one of these accelerators, and if you can get funding, like nothing beats like working on some idea full time than having a timeshare between working on your like having a day job and then trying to think of all these other things. it's much more like easier to focus on one thing. So if there is an option to go raise funding, even some seed fund which allows them to like work full time, I would recommend that.
So had you guys not gotten into YC, what like how do you view that alternate universe? What would have happened?
I think we would have still like explored this idea, like maybe on a much slower time scale, wherein we would have tried to like talk to people who want this solve, like similarly start off some open source repo and like start providing value and figure out if that this is a problem that needs solved. I think YC only changed like it made us like both pursue this full time and accelerate the process wherein you can dedicate all 27 days a week, at least 10, 12 hours thinking about this problem and figuring out where can you add value. So I think
And
with or without YC, I think we would have still ended up pursuing this.
yeah, this whole thing of where so your brother is based in the valley
Yeah,
and you're in London, and there's like what, like a 8 hour time zone difference, 7 8 hours time zone
yeah.
difference. Do you plan to continue it that way? Like after YC, you're gonna be in London and he's gonna be in the valley, or like how are you thinking about the team construct, the way it's going to, or are you like fully remote? Like how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I think right now, like I'll come back to London end of September, like then figure out some of these visa challenges. If I can move to US, I think it's much more easier to be within the same room and ideate and build together than on a time zone which is like 8 hours different. But if
Yeah.
not, yeah, like still have to think like what is the second best alternative that doesn't work out.
What do you think about the talent in London? I mean, regardless of where you end up, just the AI talent that you see in London. You've been now in London for how many? I think 5 years, if not more.
Yeah, I was in London for 6 years.
Yeah, and so you obviously had the time to explore the city from a talent perspective. Meta obviously is a huge hotbed for talent, especially in AI now, given just the growth of Llama. But even before that, your views for people that might not be from London, to tell them what's happening in London in the AI world, or
Oh
even
man,
in
like
the on the infra distributed computing side.
yeah.
Either ways.
Yeah, I mean, like London has amazing talent. Like I went to like many meetups, like including yours, and there are a bunch of really awesome meetups that happen in London. And I've been there, and it's really incredible all the things people are working on. There's sort of like a similar vibe as SF, like the density of talent and what people, the cool things they're exploring, and everyone is trying to look at some AI thing in their free time. So I would say like London is an awesome place to be.
Yeah, and you foresee like being able to hire in London for what you're doing,
Yeah,
just
I think
given
so.
the this
Like,
den.
yeah. And also, like, I think most big tech giants have like huge offices in London, which also makes it like there's a huge talent pool. And also, like, many people from Europe end up like working in London. So I do think there's incredible talent within London.
Do you see a lot of that infra talent in London though? Or like a lot of these large companies, for example, do they just run their entire infra from the US? I mean, obviously there'll be localized sort of teams and stuff, but like on the just on the infra side, do you see a lot of talent that might have the kind of scale that who have experience of just working at scale?
Yeah, I think it's no longer the case that like the big things run in US and London is just a smaller hub. Like even classic example is even Google's DeepMind is entirely based out of London, which is they have like massive office there. Similarly, like in other big tech companies I've worked, like London has like equal share of hard infra projects and people drive it entirely out of London. So I don't think there is that sort of like, yeah, I do think there's an amazing infra talent too.
And so, what's the feedback you would give to your friends who are back in India?
Yeah, I think that's a hard. I haven't thought much like what would be the right way. I'm originally from Bangalore, and
Yeah,
every single time I go to every year when I go back to Bangalore, I'm mind blown like how fast Bangalore is developing.
yeah,
And I haven't had chance to explore much of like the startup scene there or go to meetups, but I do
yeah,
think like there's incredible talent even in Bangalore. I would
yeah,
say like make the decision based on where do you see your future to be? Like, do you want to be closer to Europe and US? And it's much easier to sell something into US with an 8 hour
yeah.
time zone difference than India, where it's like much larger.
Yeah, I was on another podcast with Rishabh. Mehrotra, who leads AI at SourceGraph. He helped set up ShareChat's ML team in London, and he was sharing how India is great in terms of just the density and the willingness for people to try out new things. He did, however, add that for certain senior roles, especially for like staff engineer roles and things like AI,
Okay.
Europe might be a little better just because of the kinds of exposure that people have had. Like, you're more likely to have worked across multiple different aspects of global companies in a
Yeah.
place like London, as opposed to in India, where you might have worked on large scale projects, but either they were very specialized on one topic, or they might be for a very local market, like just the Indian ecosystem, like for example
Yeah.
e-commerce, if you look at it, or things like
Yeah.
that. But just wondering if you had any thoughts, like for example, if you look at the Meta team right in London and compare that to India. I don't know how much cutting edge work of Meta is actually happening in India. I know they have a huge customer operations part where they might fight spam and things like that, but like I don't really know if there's like a lot of core engineering work happening in Meta India versus when I look at Meta London. Obviously, the AR VR lab is here.
Yeah.
There's probably a lot of work on different aspects of the user facing product, which is happening as well. So that's the other sort of, and on top of that, I think the research institutes are obviously much more advanced, just given the number of PhD level programs that they have in Cambridge,
Yeah.
Oxford, Imperial.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense. Like, I think Meta doesn't have an engineering office in India itself. Like, they're primarily London is the largest outside US. But also, I think now London is a good, because of the visa constraints, is much simpler with global talent and things. So, if you're looking for exploring a different culture and like within great talent density, I do think London is an amazing opportunity to come and explore.
Awesome. It's been great, Nikhil. Thank you so much. And if there's any startups out here who are looking to build, I mean, just looking to try out new products on the infra side when it comes to especially non-Nvidia based chipsets, you should absolutely give Felafax a try. They are obviously very, very early, still going through YC, but that means that you're gonna get a one-on-one time with Nikhil right now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rishabh, for doing this and also like all the amazing cool things you're doing with Svagat. And yeah, I started my journey there and it was incredible to meet awesome people.
Oh, that's awesome. Actually, before we go, any feedback for people who are looking to apply to YC? Any, just because you went through the entire process. Did you get through the first time? Did you have to apply more than once?
So my brother and I, we applied, I think 8 years back too, like when we're 8 or 10 years when we were still in college with the, and now we applied and we got in. I would say like for YC, just be authentic. If you're truly passionate about what you're solving and you're one of the kind of have like an expertise in that area, like explain concisely like why it matters and be passionate. And I think that's all that
Got
is.
it. That's awesome, man. Nikhil, all the best with your journey and Felafax, and yeah, just can't wait to see what you guys do.